All right, we did this video last year, so I figured I'd do it again this year. This is my 2023 recap and what I'm planning to do with the channel in 2024. So with the help of a couple notes, let's do a quick 2023 recap. Last year in the video, I said that Rust was my language of choice. It still is. I was happy with it. I am happy with it. I foresee that going forward into the future many years at this point. And I'm getting better at Rust every day and seeing it used in more and more places every day, which fills me with confidence about that choice. Number two is WASM. Now, I've used WASM a lot more and I'm much more knowledgeable this year than I was last year at a similar time. I've worked with it professionally enough with clients in WASM in the browser and with WGPU, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I also became much more familiar with the web UI side of WASM. And I feel like this is the side that when people first hear about WASM and maybe they've worked on the web for a while, this is the version of WASM that people go, oh, this is compiling whatever else to building whatever in the browser, UI in the browser, replacing JavaScript. And while there's a kernel of truth to that, it's not entirely the truth, you know? So I'll leave it at, to some extent, that's a viable way to think about WASM in the browser. It is not the only way. It is also not the way that I see most people using it right now. However, my favorite web framework in that area is Leptos, which has grown a lot over the past year, and I find myself drifting towards it whenever I need to do web UI work. Other frameworks like Vue are still maintaining releases, so that makes me feel very confident about the WASM UI Rust web space, whatever you want to call that space, moving forward. And it seems very collaborative, which fills me with additional confidence that the ecosystem is going to move forward stronger together. At this point, I do feel like Rust is the best language to write WASM in, due to not just features like cargo, but also due to Rust's low runtime overhead and its ease of embeddability in other languages. So overall, WASM did really well. In last year's video, I talked about Bevy and WGPU and how those were sort of long-term 5-year plus goals for me. And I still continue to think about my progress in those technologies on a 5-year timeline. I think I've done a lot to improve my game programming and GPU rendering knowledge, and I'm now capable of building simpler effects like cell shading or pixelation with confidence. I've also built out a whole swath of smaller games like Breakout, Pong, 2048, Snake, and more. I got better at working with signed distance fields and built out a couple of CPU-based ray tracers, which was really fun. So I think I'm on a really good path here compared to where I wanted to be last year, but I still haven't shipped a game to Steam, which was one of my goals. I think this is a combination of two different factors. One is that shipping a game to Steam and releasing it to the public feels a little bit scary, which allowed the other mounting work that I had to do to kind of just override that and forever keep it as a second priority. So overall, thumbs up. My knowledge is getting better in these areas. I'm doing better. I'm making more things, but I didn't quite ship that game that I wanted to. Which leads us to embedded programming, which is the space that I'm easily making the least progress in compared to where I wanted to be last year. I do still have a couple of Picos and breadboards and debug probes and things like that, but the InQ frame that I got last year and showed turned out to be the wrong one. It was the wrong screen in the right packaging. So I had a little bit of extra work to do to figure out how to fit that into what I already figured was a non-working driver, which luckily my friend Derek has already built, and I'm looking forward to actually getting that done this year. However, I'm finding it difficult to find educational material around embedded programming, and the projects I do take on end up taking so long that it's really hard to make a video about or even complete them. However, I do have everything I need to build and deploy programs to the Pico W, and I have done that, so that's good, but I would like to make more progress on that front. It's really just a matter of allocating the time. So not really a thumbs up, but I did get some stuff done. And that brings us to what I'm doing in 2024. I said it once in the beginning, but Rust is working out really well for me, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. The more places I look, whether it's the Linux kernel, the Microsoft kernel, game development, embedded programming, or even the web UI, Rust seems to be everywhere and getting more and more adoption. So with that in mind, this year I'd like to develop some better teaching methods for some of the more advanced techniques or topics inside of Rust. Bevy and WGPU are of course a 5-year plus sequence for me, so I'll still be investing in those areas. This year is very much going to be I am weak at drawing hands, so I'm going to draw 100 hands kind of year in the Bevy and WGPU front. So that comes down to expanding in two directions. One is building games in general, and the other is learning Bevy internals more. I did try to participate in the last Bevy Game Jam in December, but I was also doing Advent of Code videos every day, and it didn't quite work out, and I didn't end up submitting what I had at the end of the jam. For the next game jam, I'd love to take a week and just dedicate that week to participating in the jam and build and finish a game that I can submit. However, last month's game jam did what I wanted it to do, and it sparked some renewed interest in creating these games. For one, it started off a cozy block tower game, or a small puzzle car parking game, and more recently, a 2D pixelation effect on 3D scenes. I'd also like to do more visualizations for my blog posts this year. I started this work last year with the signed distance fields posts, but the implementation needs a little bit of work before I can effortlessly use it on future posts. And when it comes to rendering specifically in WGPU, fragment and vertex shaders are something I'm pretty comfortable with at this point, but compute shaders don't rise to the same level. There's a lot that I can do here too, though, to improve my compute shader knowledge, including porting one of my ray tracers from the CPU to the GPU. I'll also take some time and dive deeper into the WGPU compute shader examples, which could each be a video in themselves. I'd also like to get into using compute shaders to do more particle system-like things, and eventually even maybe brute forcing some of the advent of code problems that really needed that extra processing power. I've already started using compute shaders a little bit more during the January event, I guess you call it. Is it an event? However, I kind of got stuck on day 4 working on this pixelation shader with a toon shader underneath that doesn't actually use compute shaders at all. It's all fragment. 2D global illumination is something that I would like to dive into more, but I don't anticipate satisfying that for quite a while, actually. There's a really great paper and some YouTube videos by Alexander Sanikov on a 2D global illumination radiance cascades technique. But my own global illumination knowledge is really kind of letting me down a bit here, with the paper kind of leaving out some things that are, too obvious to explain or left as an exercise to the reader kind of vibe. Either way, having this paper at all has been a real driving force for me to do more research into global illumination, and I am making a little bit of progress every once in a while. Finally, for Bevy, I might end up getting a Steam Deck this year because I do want to start building games for mobile systems a little bit more. And while Bevy isn't necessarily ready to target a Switch, it can run on the Steam Deck. And from what I've seen in some of the issues, it might end up being able to run on a Playdate as well at some point. Getting to the next topic, WASM, I'm pretty firmly positive about WASM in general. Although I'm not at the point where I would suggest that everybody goes and, rewrites everything in Rust and targets WASM for the browser. I do say that my experience with Leptos, especially over the last year, has been pretty fantastic. That said, Leptos Islands are something that I really want to get better acquainted with, as they really seem like a great fit for the kinds of sites I'm building these days. My first step there is actually rebuilding my personal blog with Leptos Islands, so at some point expect a video on that. WASM outside of the browser is also something I'd like to invest a little bit more in. Projects like Zlige are starting to use WASM as a plugin API system, and projects like Hermit allow you to build cross-platform WASM binaries. Overall, I'm generally interested in taking a deeper look at what the state of the ecosystem is for WASM outside of the browser, as well as taking a little bit more of a look at newer specs like the WASM component model and runtimes like WASMtime. That said, I'm going to re-up my interest in embedded again this year, even though I didn't quite fulfill it last year. With that in mind, my theme for this year is effectively small scoped projects. Every time I look at the sort of small electronics that are on my desk, I find myself wanting to be able to build them more and more. And to that end, like I said, I'm investing in small scoped projects that are almost useless on their own, but they should set my base to be able to build up into larger projects. For example, I use timecode in some of my videos. I would love to be able to read the timecode signal out onto a PicoW. You also just noticed on the device I just showed that there's a large dial. I would love to be able to create something that is basically a keyboard with a dial like that. So I need to be able to power that motor and potentially introduce some haptics and potentially, read the magnetic fields. I do have a lot of skills still to develop in embedded, and writing the Rust code is actually the easiest part for me right now. I mean, surface mount soldering, what is that? So that covers my personal growth this year. It's time to talk about what I'm doing with Rust Adventure. I view YouTube as a more experimental place where I try out new crates and talk about new Rust releases, cover new language features and how to use them, and other things like that. Topics like, the latest WASM framework like Leptos show up on YouTube first. And then after I get enough experience with them, they are worked into workshops that I then release on Rust Adventure later. To date, Rust Adventure has workshops covering Bevy, serverless functions, Rust CLI tools, and more. But the biggest question I want to answer this year is, or the one that I hear the most from people who are using Rust Adventure to learn, is where do I start? Many people want a well-defined path. They want to come in, say, start here, and then go through that. And to this point, Rust Adventure has kind of worked in streams. So there's kind of like a Bevy path, and then like a CLI tools path, and then like a serverless functions path, and so on. So from my research, it seems like people kind of want this more guided path, and they want it to start with the Rust language in isolation. To that end, I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the beginning part of that journey and working on a path that starts with the Rust language itself before connecting into those workshops. One other thing that I would love to do this year is, with the advent of Typist, I really dropped all the barriers that were preventing me from writing longer form content. And that specifically is book length. I didn't want to set up a large custom markdown pipeline to try to write a book in, and I didn't really want to use LaTeX or LaTeX, however you recognize that. I think a longer form book introduces an interesting surface area that complements the videos and written descriptions that are digital that currently exist on the Rust Adventure site. So it would be great, in my opinion, to finish at least one of those books this year. Now, there are some modifications I need to make to the site itself. For example, the Netlify functions workshops are probably going to be deprecated this year, and I'm going to move all of those to AWS Lambda for serverless. The Bevy workshops themselves are kind of hard to keep up with. There's a potentially breaking release every 3 months for Bevy. So that's 4 versions per year per workshop. And some of the Bevy workshops can get pretty long. They're some of the longest on the site. So I think to solve this problem, what I'm going to do is develop some more introductory level Bevy workshops that are easier to update, that then support the longer workshops. And then I can chop some of those longer workshops down because that content will have been covered earlier in the process. There are also dependency issues that I need to keep in mind when I'm making these workshops. People really like to have, the 0.12 version of Bevy when 0.12 drops the day of. But that's not always possible with some of the longer tail crates in the ecosystem. For example, Bevy ECS LDTK, while a wonderful, great crate that I very much appreciate, is kind of at the tail end of 3 updates. So Bevy updates, and then Bevy ECS tilemap has to update, and then Bevy ECS LDTK can update after that. What this leads to is kind of a longer chain of updates where Bevy ECS LDTK can update months after a release goes out. So deciding what to actually cover will affect when those workshops can be updated, because the workshop, as it stands, would be the 4th update on the end of that. So the next 3 workshops for Rust Adventure are going to be an introduction to WASM, something very straightforward and basic, an introduction to Leptos, building on that WASM knowledge, and an introduction to Axum, because we'll need that for some of the Leptos content. And finally, my scripting workflow has been much the same for the last couple years. I write a lot in Notion, thousands and thousands of words. And I'm not super happy with the Notion writing experience, and I never really have been. So I think it's time to reevaluate and make sure that even if Notion isn't the best place to be or the perfect place to be, that it's still the right place to be. So to do that, I'm already experimenting with some other tools like Obsidian and some other text editors like NeoVim and Emacs again. That'll become its own video. I assume that will take me quite a while to figure out because I don't want to slow down any of my production while I'm looking at that. So that's what I'm doing for 2024. What are you doing? What are you getting up to? What are you learning? What are you focusing on? As you might be able to tell, I'm not much of a goals person. I'm more of a, I want to focus on this and focus on that and spend time here kind of person. So whether you've got goals or habits that you want to bring into the new year, let me know what they are in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.